Thank you, Susanna, Honourable Vice Minister of Natural Resources and Environment, CEO of the Mekong River Commission, distinguished delegates and colleagues. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here this morning and the opportunity to contribute to this very important conference, and my congratulations to the MRC for staging this and convening this event. I was asked to speak on the topic of innovation in transboundary cooperation, working better together through efficient and effective processes that focus on impact at regional and national levels. The way I want to address that is to present to you an approach to driving the changes needed for future water security by setting high ambition missions, and how this mission-driven agenda can be applied to and help to catalyze innovation in transboundary cooperation. To get started, I would like to introduce the Transformative Futures for Water Security Initiative, which IMI co-convened over the last year with a network of more than 60 partner organizations. We set out to bring together water stakeholders across policy, business, development, and science communities to create an agenda for water with high ambition in the lead up to the UN 2023 Water Conference in New York, and as the basis for our commitment to the Water Action Agenda. High ambition is so critical because, of course, water security is under enormous pressure because of soaring demand for water, for food production, energy generation, and economic development. Competition for water is increasing and pollution is worsening. And also because water risks and extremes are intensifying as climate change is supercharging the water cycle. Climate change is adding energy to the hydrological cycle, increasing the frequency and severity of extreme floods, drought, precipitation, and storms, while the availability of water is disrupted by shifting monsoons and rainfall patterns, and sea level rise is driving the salinization of land and groundwater for coasts and islands. These are all patterns and projections that are very familiar in Southeast Asia and in the Mekong. And alongside this, we have to remember also that as the IPCC water chapter from 2021 reported, water-related risks are projected to increase with every increment of warning. It doesn't stop here. Therefore, we have to face a very uncomfortable question in this region and globally. Will water security be out of reach in future without bold and urgent transformation of water systems? In the Transformative Futures Initiative, we set out to bridge the science policy action gap by using dialogue to align collective action. The dialogue was designed to generate a set of high ambition missions for inclusive science-based action on water security. We defined missions as big, difficult goals for transforming water security that will create impact at scale by combining applied research, policy change, private sector action, investment, and inclusive development based on advancing equality between women and men and between generations. Our process in the Transformative Futures Initiative was bottom-up. It was rooted in South-South dialogue and implemented using a model for what we called youth co-guardianship. We implemented the initiative in partnership with the World Youth Parliament for Water, as well as regional youth networks in the places that we were working. We held online regional dialogues in 8 regions, here in Southeast Asia, across Asia and Africa to Latin America during last December and during January of this year. And the process culminated then in a final in-person conference in Cape Town in South Africa in February, as well as here in Vientiane, we held a parallel session with participants from this region. And we used the inputs from those regional dialogues to design these 8 missions for inclusive science-based action on water security. In all, throughout the process, more than 400 mainly Global South organizations took part across the process, and more than 1,000 people. Within that final conference, 185 participants from 55 countries and 144 organizations. The 8 missions that emerged out of this process are on the screen. These are stakeholder-driven priorities for research, policy, action, and investment. So without going into the details of all of them, they cover 4 critical systemic outcomes. The first is build farmers' resilience to climate change and water risks. Second is deliver sustainable stakeholder-driven wash services. Third is increase freshwater availability. And the fourth is make water infrastructure future-ready. And then there are 4 enabling levers of systemic change: overcoming data and information barriers, make water decisions fit for the future, integrating multiple values and sectors, then adapt to future water regimes and risks. And of particular importance to this conference, of course, then the final one, which I have circled on the screen, deliver good water governance and transboundary cooperation that is inclusive, participatory, equitable, accountable, responsive, and smart. Our next steps in the Transformative Futures Initiative are to elaborate how to align collective action to deliver these missions. How then should we elaborate a mission-driven strategy for transboundary cooperation, and one that is, as stakeholders called for, inclusive, participatory, equitable, accountable, responsive, and smart? To begin to answer this, actually I want to go back to 2012, to a conference held by IUCN in Chiang Rai in Thailand. Now, as some people will know, prior to joining IMI in 2018, I was for 10 years the director of the Global Water Program in IUCN. And with the IUCN Environmental Law Center and IUCN regional programs, including the Water and Wetlands Program here in this region, I co-led an initiative called Building River Dialogues and Governance, or the BRIDGE program, that supported, and it still does, transboundary cooperation in more than a dozen basins across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And in 2012, we hosted the Asia Hydro Diplomacy Conference. So in preparing for today's presentation, I went back to the conclusions from that conference because they're very pertinent to this idea of a mission-driven transboundary cooperation. So the conference concluded that water is complex, and that, I'm quoting here, hydrodiplomacy must provide ways to engage proactively with the complexities of transboundary management. It must provide the theory and practice to implement adaptive water management for complex water issues. Hydrodiplomacy calls on scientific and technical experts to work hand in hand with national and local politicians, decision makers, and stakeholders to reach negotiated agreements that can be implemented. Hydrodiplomacy starts with national interests, but must reflect economic development, security, and citizens' interests. Hydrodiplomacy, the conference concluded, works under the authority of governments, but for water agreements to be implemented, for them to lead to systems change, they need the agreement of water users. Agreements are key, but they have to deliver results on the ground for water, food, and energy security, for healthy ecosystems and climate resilience, for people's health, well-being, and equity. So why am I highlighting this? Because it tells us that we need to understand transboundary cooperation as integrating diplomacy, so the affairs of states, with change management for water systems, change in complex water systems. And therefore, a mission-driven strategy for water cooperation should combine innovation for systems change in water management with support for water diplomacy. Okay, so what does that mean practically? To illustrate how water diplomacy in complex water systems works, I want to introduce to you a conceptual model and then tell a story about change in a real basin that showcases how this model works. Then I'll use the conclusions from this in framing some principles and a mission for transboundary cooperation. I mentioned the BRIDGE program. And based on learning across the BRIDGE basins, we came up with this model for managing change in basin governance. And it starts, as you see in the dark blue square, it starts with the point that governance is fundamentally about agreements. But it takes many agreements, a multiplicity of agreements, for governance to drive change. A multiplicity of agreements with spanning informal to formal agreements, spanning local to intergovernmental agreements. And it says that we activate change through facilitation and cooperation, as you see in the green box. So activating change through facilitation and cooperation by creating space for bringing people together, joint action across scales, supporting the agreement of water users, and taking those incremental steps, and backed by help and brokering across scales, backed by communications and advocacy, and backed by the critical issue of data and information. But periodically, actors and institutions combine with external events, with realignments of actors and drivers from other domains, such as energy, climate, trade, etc., to create a big step forward, a large jump forward in governance that changes the game. So now to the practical story. This is from the Catamayo-Chira Basin shared by Ecuador and Peru. And the starting point here is around 2012, with a set of problems that were related to degraded lands in the upstream part of the basin in Ecuador that were causing sedimentation in the downstream portion of the basin in Peru, affecting high-value irrigation agriculture for export. And there was no transboundary cooperation mechanism or basin organization to take up this problem, and in fact a history of tension and even conflict over water between the two countries. So instead, at local level, communities came together to plan joint action, which led them to form a basin platform of local governments and provincial authorities, which coordinated action between them on basin restoration and on payments for ecosystem services. So the local stakeholders, thinking back to that model, the local stakeholders, they put in place agreements that led to incremental steps in governance change and water management. And this led to a proposal to form a basin commission for the CGIAR. And that's where external events came into play. There were new initiatives for cooperation between the two countries emerging at that time on energy, environment, and mining, for example. And so a set of the local actors and national political actors, including local champions local champions and advocates from the CGIAR, they came together to advocate for and create a new binational commission on basin management for Peru and Ecuador. So a new binational commission for the integrated management of water resources in all nine of the transboundary basins that Peru and Ecuador share bilaterally. So in 2016, the two presidents signed a joint declaration to open negotiations, and then the resulting agreement has now been ratified by Peru and awaits ratification by Ecuador, with strategic action plans in place already for several of the basins, including the CGIAR. So based on this change model and the learning from cases such as CGIAR, what could a mission-driven strategy for transboundary cooperation look like? First, let's recall that missions are intended to align collective action around a common goal. Second, a mission of transboundary cooperation must build on what's already in place. So here in the Mekong, for example, it must build on and complement the basin development strategy. It must align to the work of the regional Flood and Drought Management Center. It must support data and information sharing mechanisms. But then to augment this, as was called for in the opening plenary yesterday, new ideas for cooperation and new ideas for impact that are guided by the change model for governance that I've shown, and its pillars and components of cooperation and facilitation, and the principles highlighted by the case of the CGIAR for catalyzing and managing complex water systems that support more successful water diplomacy. Principles such as dialogue at multiple levels, problem solving through joint action, building capacity, champions motivated to advocate for change, use of data and information and maps, this idea of a multiplicity of agreements spanning informal to formal, local to national to regional, and of course institutions and basin organizations that are mandated to support cooperation. A mission-driven strategy for transboundary cooperation will align collective action to help agreements reach the ground and deliver results, with bottom-up dialogue and joint action complementing formal agreements and modalities for transboundary cooperation. As this region is very familiar with, for example, the WLE Mekong forums that were facilitated by CGIAR and IMI in around 2011 to 2018, the MRC regional stakeholder forums and various initiatives that are around and emerging. A mission-driven strategy also has the possibility, of course, of integrating those other missions, which I had on the screen earlier, into the missions that align to the priorities that countries have for cooperation, such as farmers' resilience, future-ready water infrastructure that integrates built infrastructure and nature-based solutions, overcoming data and information barriers, adapting to future water regimes and risks, and so on. For research for development organizations like mine, such as IMI, a mission orientation will also ensure that our programs are integrated into collective action, that we are responsive to the priorities of stakeholders and address needs across that science policy action gap, and that if water security now and in the future demands the transformation of water systems, that water research and innovation is focused on much more than more modeling, more data, and more technologies, but also, as a set of the partners from the Transboundary Futures Initiative published in the journal Water Nature just before the New York conference, also that research helps us to understand water systems better, and that research and innovation is itself designed to catalyze and deliver systems change. Good examples of this from IMI's research and the One CGIAR portfolio are initiatives on, for example, Nexus Gains, which is working in the Indus, the Ganges, the Nile, and the Amudarya Basin. And in this region, the Agroecology and the National Policies and Strategies Initiative, as well as work we do to enhance social inclusion, work we do on data for decision making, such as water accounting, work we do on flood and drought resilience, and so on. So to conclude, I said at the outset I was asked to speak on the topic of innovation in transboundary cooperation and processes that can more effectively drive impact. Based on the stakeholder inputs received from more than 400 organizations under the Transformative Futures for Water Secure initiative, I advocate that a mission-driven strategy can help catalyze innovation by applying principles from systems change to reinforce water diplomacy, by aligning collective action, by research, policy, development, the private sector, and investment, and that we converge, so that we converge on the high ambition and shared agenda for science-based action that is so critical for the future of water security. At the core of all this is therefore partnership, in which we all, from the science, policy, development, and business communities, we all align our efforts to accelerate progress to water security. We at IMI have committed under the Water Action Agenda, concluded in the New York conference, to working through coalitions to promote and apply a mission-driven strategy for transformation of future water security. And we're looking forward to working with the MRC, with the riparian countries, with the LMC, with all stakeholders, to taking this approach forward for transboundary cooperation in the Mekong and beyond as well. So I thank you.